Kurt Goldstein was born on November 6, 1878, into a Jewish family in Upper Silesia in the east of the German Empire to a Jewish family. His father owned a lumber yard. Although not formally educated himself, Goldstein's father held scholarship in high regard. He felt that a good education was the most proper way to prepare for life, and because of this, ensured that all his sons obtained university degrees. As a child, Kurt was described as being shy and quiet. His love of reading earned him the nickname, Professor, at the public school he attended in Katowice. The Goldstein family relocated to the metropolitan city of Breslau, now the Polish city of Wrocław, after a few years, where he attended the Humanistische Gymnasium. After graduation, he planned to study philosophy at the university level, but his father didn't approve of this choice, as he considered it an unprofitable art, and sent Goldstein to work at a relative's business. After a short period working at the business, his father reluctantly allowed him to enroll at Breslau University. He stayed there for only one term before he transferred to the University of Heidelberg, where he was able to pursue their study of Neo-Kantian philosophy and literature, where he was introduced to the concepts of Karl Wernicke. 1 year later, Goldstein went back to Breslau, where he studied medicine. Under the instruction of Wernicke, he focused his study on neurology and psychiatry, and obtained his medical degree at the age of 25. In 1903, neurologist Ludwig Edinger invited Goldstein to the Psychiatrisches Neurologisches Institute at the University of Frankfurt, where he became Edinger's assistant between October 1903 and September 1904. Edinger became one of the most influential figures in Goldstein's career. After a time in Königsberg, now the Kaliningrad Oblast of Russia, Goldstein returned to work with Edinger in 1914, at the Neurological Institute in Frankfurt as first assistant. Their goal was to investigate comparative neuroanatomy and neuropathology. After Edinger's death in 1918, Goldstein became acting director of the Neurological Institute. From 1917 to 1927, he yielded conceptual aspects of neurological conditions including tonus disturbances, agnosia, aphasia, apraxia, and general behavioral changes after a brain injury. In July 1922, he was appointed Associate Professor for Neurology and Director of the Neurological Institute. In 1923, he assumed the role of Professor of Neurology. In 1926, psychoanalyst Fritz Perls became Goldstein's assistant for a year. Perls and his wife Laura would go on to become the co-developers of Gestalt therapy. Goldstein's research and theory had a massive influence on the formation of this new psychotherapy. Later that year, Goldstein accepted a position at the University of Berlin and the director of neurology at Berlin-Mobit General Hospital. The hospital was established to study his patients' neurological conditions. In 1927, he was instrumental in organizing the International Society for Psychotherapy. He published material on the roles of the nurse, physician and social worker for inpatient care of brain-injured patients. In 1938, he was to read the William James Lectures on Philosophy and Psychology at Harvard, and these were later published. He was clinical professor of neurology at Tufts Medical School, and was also active on the staff of the Boston Dispensary's Clinic for Nervous Diseases. Between 1906 and 1914, Goldstein worked in a psychiatric clinic in Königsberg. Here he realized that the patients were not receiving proper treatment. During World War I, he treated a large number of soldiers with traumatic brain injuries at the clinic, and he established the Institute for Research into the Consequences of Brain Injuries. He served as the director of the clinic until 1930. It was there that he also developed his theory of brain-mind relationships. He applied the figure ground principle from perception to the whole organism. In this application, the whole organism existed as the ground for the individual stimulus that formed the figure. This idea became an early criticism of the simple behavioral stimulus response theory. When Hitler was appointed Chancellor in January 1933, Goldstein was arrested and held in a basement. After a week, he was released on the condition that he would agree to leave the country immediately and never come back. For the next year he lived in Amsterdam, supported by the Rockefeller Foundation, and wrote his classic, The Organism. He then immigrated to the United States October 1934, and became a citizen in April 1941. He worked at the Psychiatric Institute in New York City, Montefiore Hospital as attending neurologist, and made connections with Columbia University in New York. Between 1940 and 1945, he worked at the Tufts Medical School in Boston as the clinical professor of neurology. In 1946, he returned to New York City, where he established a private practice. While in the United States, H3 coined the phrase, self-actualization. Goldstein met American psychologist named Abraham Maslow, who was at Brandeis University. Maslow became influenced greatly by Goldstein's ideas, particularly self-actualization. Later, this principle would become a fundamental concept in Maslow's need hierarchy theory of motivation. Self-actualization was an essential component to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but differed from Goldstein's original concept. Maslow described self-actualization as realizing one's full potential and seeking personal growth. Maslow felt that self-actualization would only be met if all fundamental needs had been satisfied first. Goldstein's holistic approach is described in his book, The Organism. Rather than looking at certain phenomena, such as the patellar reflex, as singular events, he tried to understand them as components of a holistic organism. Although he believed it was possible that reflexes could exist by themselves, his approach postulated that they always exist in concurrence with another process in their body. While hitting the kneecap with a rubber hammer or testing the pupillary response might seem to be a simple example of an isolated reflex, Goldstein argued that a holistic approach would be necessary to fully understand what the body is experiencing. In his book, The Organism, he writes, "If, in examining a man's pupillary reflex, we obtain a relatively constant contraction of the iris, this is possible only because the individual, so to speak, surrenders his eye to us and completely forgoes the usual act of seeing, i.e., the visual prehension of some environmental feature. Of course, it is true that in real vision the diameter of the pupil changes according to the amount of light on the seen object. But it certainly is not true that the same light intensity will produce the same contraction when it affects the organ in isolation, as in the reflex examination, and when it acts upon the eye of the person who deliberately regards an object. Although it is not easy to prove this experimentally, one only needs to contrast the pupillary reaction of a man looking interestedly at a brightly illuminated object with the reaction of an eye which has been exposed in isolation, to the same light intensity. The difference in pupillary reaction is immediately manifest. Goldstein asserts that, when observing a phenomenon within an organism, humans instinctively isolate that observation from the context in an attempt to understand it better. Yet, in doing so, they miss the essence or intrinsic nature of the organism. Rather than attempting to understand single facets of a situation, he believes it is essential to understand the situation in which the phenomenon arose. To illustrate this idea, Kurt Goldstein gives the example of a person first learning how to ride a bicycle. Initially, the person will attempt various motions in an attempt to succeed. While some motions fail to manifest in success, eventually the individual will understand how to coordinate their body in respect to the bicycle, and ride successfully. While a smoothly propelled bike may signify accomplishment, looking at the coordinated movements of the learner and the smile that results is also another sign. So, when looking at a single aspect of a phenomenon instead of the whole, Goldstein argues one misses the true nature of the phenomenon. He developed an approach whereby a situation, or phenomenon is analyzed holistically, rather than simply looking at an isolated event. First, when observing a situation, interpretations should be taken in as a whole without giving special preference toward one part of the phenomenon. When describing the phenomenon, attention should not be diverted to one aspect of the phenomenon that may be of interest. The holistic approach calls instead for the phenomenon to be described from all angles without bias toward one part. Lastly, he argues that you must consider each and every phenomenon in reference to the entire situation. Although trained as a medical doctor, Kurt Goldstein pioneered many important advances in psychology. As an early pioneer of neuropsychology, he studied the effects of brain damage on abstraction abilities. His work led him to conclude that although physical areas of the brain, such as the frontal lobes and the subcortical ganglia, may be damaged, psychological trauma was a more pressing concern. His conclusions on schizophrenia emphasized the disease as a protective mechanism against anxiety rather than an organic defect. Following the research of a German neurologist named Hermann Oppenheim on war-related trauma, Goldstein focused upon understanding the trauma of soldiers returning from duty in World War I. At the time, physicians thought soldiers were faking symptoms in order to receive a pension, and there was little research to prove otherwise. Goldstein and his team attempted to look at this from a holistic perspective by theorizing that all neural networks were interconnected. Therefore, any trauma you receives from the war would directly impact the neural networks. He later tried to rehabilitate patients suffering from war trauma. At the time, most of the suffering veterans were placed in asylums. Goldstein intended to bring back the normal function of patients by introducing multidisciplinary care teams consisting of medical, orthopedic, physiological, and psychological personnel, as well as a school facility to provide workshops for patients. His efforts resulted in successful rehabilitation of many soldiers. 73% of patients were able to return to their old jobs, while only 10% were still hospitalized. He died on September 19, 1965, in New York, in the United States. He was 86 years old.